In some partnerships, only the choice to withdraw is sufficient to cause a serious crisis for the other person there. There were no shouts or betrayals. You just decided to take a step back. Autonomy, silence, and distance. But the other, breakdowns, allegations of rage and panic, sadness, as though your absence had removing a basic component from their soul. This outsized response has an explanation, and it lacks logic. As Carl Gustav Jung, a psychic, teaches us that in numerous bonds, particularly those directed by unconscious entities that do not perceive you as a person, but as a representation of you, are shaped cognitively by the other person's projection. To hold a particular position within their structure of emotions, you become the mother they need. Tends to a father who guards a mirror that confirms a support that maintains things standing. And that's just what crumbles when you go. Isn't the illusion is only the relationship. It is the unintentional assistance that you symbolize that you are more than just yourself. John, were they emotionally balanced? Bowlby's notion of attachment, in addition to, according to Mary Ainsworth's research, many form emotional ties that are characterized by a persistent apprehension of abandonment. Individuals with nervous attachment live, keep an eye out for them. Stability is linked with presence. Your consistency is what keeps bursting with worry when you break. What breaks in this pattern is not the love. It is the framework that maintained the emotional turmoil, was contained, and according to Margaret Mara, this instance is a forced pregnancy since the symbiotic link is severed. The other person's mental state is violently forced into the impression of separation, of uniqueness, something that could never reach its full potential for those who have been merged with the other, symbolically or emotionally. Separation without conscious thought is not a goodbye. You did not perform an amputation. Depart in the same manner that you departed, as a psychological role, as a support system, and mirror as emotional support, which is the reason the other breaks down. During this video, we will examine this phenomenon in depth with Jung. Will comprehend the function of archetypes and projections in connections with Ainsworth and Bowlby, will explore the dynamics of uneasy attachment, and will work with Mara to demonstrate how separation can touch on. All of this is hurt by primordial childhood wounds. In order for you to comprehend a difficult, but the essential reality that others are depressed about is not necessarily evidence of love, but frequently it is simply be afraid of confronting their own void without your protection. If you ever been charged with being self-centered for merely desiring freedom, if you ever felt bad about setting priorities, your tranquility, if you've ever understood that you were never the issue, but what you stood in for anything other than this. Your mirror is video. According to Carl Jung, we are all born originals, but copies that we die of are not, because we become less unique throughout life, but because we are unaware of morph into what others expect, and we anticipate the same from them in many connections, or what we refer to as love is nothing but an unintentional game of projections to which you can't relate. You can relate to others for who they really are. The perception you have of them, and, most disturbingly, the other likewise affects you in the unconsciously. You're molded into, and Jung's archetypal figure was named this universal. Intrinsic symbolic functions, representations found inside the collective unconscious, and are projected onto common figures. Thus you could inhabit without being aware of the role of the protective mother and the rescuing father, the caregiver, the hero and the spiritual mentor, or even the person who bears. What the other is unable to observe the human intellect in themselves. The injured intellect in particular cannot withstand the emptiness's tumult, so that it provides meanings, even if untrue, to preserve an internal feeling of bringing you into someone's life and establishing order can turn into that order. For your presence soothes, since it symbolizes defense. Your listening is validated, since it stands for recognizing that your silence is painful, because it is understood as a denial of the idealized form rather than as a sign of yours. And this is where the most important point: the more disengaged the other is, the more they will require from themselves. To make up for what's missing, they will put you on a pedestal that is invisible, but not to use you as a source of admiration foundation. As well as each and every foundation, when gone, the structure collapses. Consequently, when you choose to distance, what breaks down for you isn't just the unconscious, is the emotional connection. The other person's fantasy regarding they don't miss your identity. Miss the role you played in stability of emotions that your presence depicted. And when that function, desperation, emerges, not because, although they lost you, they also lost they projected their internal ground onto you. This symbolic dynamic becomes more powerful in those who haven't yet dealt with their personal dark. Jung cautioned that the procedure of indigenization is the process of becoming who. You must examine yourself to find who you really are, combining the shadow and leaving forecasts. However, many people run away from this procedure. It is simpler to locate in the other things that one does not wish to confront in oneself. Now is the time that attachment psychology is relevant, due to the fact that the symbolic projection corresponds to an anxious attachment style. The bonds pattern is more than merely symbolic, is essential. The other one not only romanticizes, they depend on you for emotional survival. And we shall talk about precisely this. What occurs in the following section when the dread of symbolic idealization meets what occurs when you are abandoned? Anchor an archetype, prepare to plunge into the shaky terrain of worried attachment. If the information is clicking the subscribe button makes sense to you, and please subscribe to the channel. For your assistance while discussing attachment, we are not, by discussing our affection, we are discussing emotional survival, as stated by John Bowlby, the inventor of attachment theory, since its inception. Our brain grows over the years of life. Types of relationships that influence how we connect with other people, and these tendencies are not at random. They originate from the recurrence of feelings that have made lasting impressions on the mind. For those who had shaky relationships as children, emotional disregard or efficient love always comes with unpredictable, a crippling fear. The fear that deserted. This is the domain of a dynamic of apprehensive attachment in which the other person's link is felt. As the nervous person's lifeline does not, they do not love carelessly, they love desperately. Not connect with the person they are holding on to them as a continuation of themselves' nervous system, and they both require each other to control oneself, to relax in order to confirm their existence by demonstrating the existence of the other serves as a protective barrier against agony and any indication of actual or perceived distance. Imagined is perceived as a danger to Mary Ainsworth, Bulb's abandonment partner, and an innovator in the field of empirical research on attachment, was evidently this in her study, which she called the odd circumstances where kids who are anxious, true panic, would set in for attachment when even yet the attached figure departed the room. They would weep for a few minutes before becoming haphazard, and when the caregiver back, they would exhibit a range of needs. This conduct does for contact and fury not fade with age. It changes apprehensive adults to repeat the similar pattern. They switch between a fierce pursuit of intimacy and connection, frequently unintentional emotional desire that the other is always accessible, always responsive. Now, consider what transpires when you even unintentionally turn into that. For someone like this, an attachment figure, you take on the role of external regulator for that individual's inner turmoil. It is predictability that provides significance to their days are calmed by your presence. Their ongoing anxiety, you end up for what the caretaker ought to have been, an emotional foundation in childhood shelter, a remedy for the fear of being abandoned. But this isn't a space of affection, it is a location of entrapment, since the smallest indication of your independence there. When necessary, the mechanism sounds an alarm. When you go, they feel rejected. They hear silence, desertion when you distance yourself, even for they understand it as personal protection. An attack, and the reaction could be the manipulation of desperation, explosive anger, or emotional blackmail. This is where the relationship with Jung comes in. Makes the nervous person's projections more intense upon you, not only a figure of symbolic importance, they undertaking redemption, and once you depart, you don't simply let you down and ruin the illusion. The disintegration of security has nothing to do with what transpired between you, concerns what the other failed to construct within of oneself a feeling of security. And this is the exact moment, Margaret Mara's point, that offers an crucial element in comprehending this suffering, since many people may not find your departure to be simply a loss. It's a psychological wound and a trauma. Beginning in early childhood, a rupture that causes wounds to become active, thus archaic that the other can hardly identify. How they feel. Psychoanalyst and psychologist Margaret Mara spent her entire life devoted to being aware of how a person actually becomes a person, and what she found is just as unsettling as it is exposing a large number of folks we encounter nowadays who are chaotic and emotionally reliant. While separated or in a desperate situation, considering the autonomy of others, are in fact kids who didn't finish the process of separation and individuation. Psychological birth for Mara does not take place together with biological one thing. About birth as leaving the womb, there will be another, far more complicated one. From the mutually beneficial union with the motherly figure, regardless of whether that figure is the mother as a caretaker or eventually as in sentimental in the initial months of life, the child does not consider itself to be a distinct entity that exists in a state of symbiosis. The child and the mother are one does not exist, and the other does. Just an effective field that isn't differentiated, where the mother's presence is the persistence of the child's existence. This fusion state is natural when life first began, but it must be broken gradually, which is what permits the growth of individualism, emotional independence, and the ability to be alone oneself. The issue is that frequently this breaking does not occur as it ought to. Insecure bonds due to early traumas. Caretakers who are unreliable can disrupt or skew this procedure. The youngster grows up not really understanding where it finishes, where the other one starts, and what doesn't fit in throughout childhood. It carries over into partnerships, and this is where everything happens in adulthood. Connects. When you turn into the mutually beneficial partner for someone who has never experienced emotional, your presence becomes unique. A portion of the individual's perception of identity, you are the outline's ground, the extent of the psychic, and when you choose to keep your distance, whether it's out of exhaustion of personal needs or just recognizing that the partnership has become poisonous, you won't simply walk away. You are attempting to force a psychic birth, ripping the other from an archaic. You claim that we are creating an illusion of oneness. This is for someone who lives in a symbiotic relationships. This encounter was dubbed unbearable by Mara. Forced delivery. The individual is terrified, but because they essentially love you, but due to their inner turmoil. Aside from your absence, it's an expression of desperation in childhood, reverberating within the symbiotic child is the adult body, stating, "I don't want you to leave me alone. Understand who I am without you." The severity of the agony arrives considering the fusion's intensity. The other person was more bonded to you. Harsh the consequences of your absence will be, and that's precisely what brings us to the following section, due to the fact that when you eventually distance yourself and end this mutually beneficial relationship. Additionally, the illusion of the other person's control over you, and when collapse occurs, the response is a product of manipulation, rage, and blackmail. Attempts to restore at any cost. Each symbiotic partnership has a fundamental delusion that the others are owed to us and belong to us. Predictability of something's time, presence, unwavering devotion to one's feelings. But what underlies this sense of belonging is an unintentional attempt to exert control, and when you begin to separate yourself from, you start establishing limits. When you begin to deny that this is invisible. Control mechanism that starts to people who live in symbiotic relationships. Disintegrate relationships or are characterized by nervous attachment frequently lack the ability to self-control. They rely on one another to keep up the illusion of emotional stability, as well as when that other person chooses to disrupt the script and depart from it. Predictability in search of their uniqueness. These individual psyches interpret the gesture as abandonment and betrayal devastation, which is why the response to your independence frequently appears your absence is not disproportionate, recognized as your entitlement, but as a personal assault, as though by separating, you are purposefully causing yourself suffering, and a risky pattern here indicates the necessity of regaining control. That this can occur directly at any cost, by passionate accusations, demands, and extortion, or more subtly, with strategic silences that are manipulative moral inversions of victimhood, in which you are charged with being self-centered for just wishing to control. Your wrath, which emerges, is not about you. Rather, it is about what you stand for, is the violation of an unwritten psychological agreement. The breach of the delusion that you would constantly be. Carl Jung is always accessible. Warns us that love is found where power is missing, and in a relationship like this, freedom and affection are replaced by power. Transforms into a control mechanism. Caring turns into deceit. The link stops being a gathering between two complete entities and changes into an emotional prison in which only one can breathe. When this kind of dynamic is occurring, is essentially a type of emotional colonization. The alternative isn't actually curious about who you are, but what you provide for them in a symbolic setting. You live in and enjoy each colony that chooses to free itself from your control. Will be viewed as a danger rather than as evolution. As you were helpful and predictable, but now that you know that you want to go now, since you've decided to be free, you turn into, it's risky right now, because many turn around because they feel bad about allowing themselves to become enmeshed in the suffering of they sacrifice their own for the other. Independence to prevent harm to others otherwise, but it's crucial to comprehend you are not harming the other person. They are distressed by the loss of authority. They are hurt since they're unsure about who they are absent from your presence as an emotional crutch, and you're unable to go on to absolve yourself in order to maintain a structure that ought to belong to the other. Accountability. We shall go into further detail in the following section. Your lack of presence does not change this reality. Brings suffering since you were cherished, yet if you tolerated what the other person did, unwilling to confront, we shall discuss to fill the existential gap that arises. Why deep, and when does the mirror disappear? You were never the reason for this downfall. If you find resonance in what you're hearing, my ebook has genuine value for you. Outside the Shadow. It dismantles Jung's key concepts and provides you with resources to learn more about yourself. The link is within the pinned. There comes a time.